Harlem, spring 1968. Bumpy Johnson is dying. Not dramatically, not with the specific theater of a man who has spent his life in dramatic circumstances meeting a dramatic end. He is dying the way most men die, slowly, incrementally, the body failing in ways that medicine can slow but not stop. His heart is bad, has been bad for years. The decades of stress, of prison, of the particular physical toll of running Harlem's underground economy through wars and raids and betrayals, and the accumulated weight of never fully resting, these things have left their mark. He is 62 years old. He looks older. He still comes to the office above Small's Paradise Jazz Club every morning. He still receives people. He still makes decisions, gives orders, maintains the organizational authority that has defined his public life since the 1930s. But the people who know him, who have known him for decades, who can read the specific language of his body and his silences, these people know that something has changed. Bumpy Johnson is thinking about what happens after. On a Tuesday morning in April, 5 young men come to see him. They have requested the meeting through the proper channels, through intermediaries, with the specific formality that approaching Bumpy Johnson has always required. They are not walk-ins. They are not supplicants asking for charity. They are men who have something to offer and who believe, for various reasons, that what they have to offer is something Bumpy Johnson needs. They are right that he needs something. They are wrong, most of them, about what it is. Illinois Gordon shows them in. 5 men, 20s to early 30s, the specific combination of ambition and capability that Harlem in 1968 produces in men who have decided they want more than the legitimate economy is offering. They stand in Bumpy's office with the studied composure of people trying not to show how much this meeting matters to them. Bumpy looks at them for a long moment. He has been looking at men like this for 40 years. Men who came to him with proposals, with capabilities, with hunger that needed direction. He has assessed thousands of them. He has hired some, rejected most, watched the ones he hired either rise or fail or betray him or die, and in 40 years has developed the specific, calibrated eye of a man who has been wrong enough times to understand what being wrong costs. He asks them a question, one question. It is not about their criminal experience, not about their network, their resources, their capability for violence, or their organizational credentials. It is something else, something unexpected, something that the 5 men in the room receive differently depending on what they are made of. 4 of them answer in ways that tell Bumpy everything he needs to know about why they are not the right choice. One of them answers correctly. That man is Frank Lucas. And everything that follows, the Invisible Empire, Blue Magic, the Country Boys, the most sophisticated criminal organization in American history, follows from the answer Frank Lucas gave in that office on a Tuesday morning in 1968. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905. He came north to Harlem in the 1920s, part of the Great Migration, part of the vast movement of Black Americans from the South's violent, constrained economy toward the North's promised, if not always delivered, opportunities. He arrived as a teenager, uneducated in the formal sense, carrying the particular intelligence of someone who has survived difficult circumstances through observation, adaptation, and the specific kind of quick thinking that difficult circumstances require. He found Harlem. He found the underground economy. He found Madame Stephanie St. Clair. Under St. Clair's mentorship, Bumpy Johnson developed the qualities that would eventually make him a legend. Not just the physical courage and the capacity for controlled violence that his role as her enforcer required, though those things were real and important. More significantly, the organizational intelligence, the strategic thinking, the understanding that power in Harlem was not simply about force but about relationships, reputation, and the specific kind of community standing that made an operator trusted rather than simply feared. Bumpy Johnson became, through the 1930s and 1940s, something that American criminal history has produced rarely, a gangster who was also a genuine community figure. Not in the cynical, performative way that some operators cultivated community relationships for instrumental purposes. In a real way, a way that reflected genuine values and genuine relationships and a genuine investment in the neighborhood that had made him. He paid rent for families who couldn't make it. He funded community organizations. He appeared at funerals and graduations and community meetings as a presence that was understood to be, whatever his criminal operations, fundamentally of the neighborhood rather than predatory toward it. This did not make him innocent. Bumpy Johnson ran numbers, ran enforcement, maintained relationships with the Italian mob that were complex and often brutal. The operations that funded the community presence were themselves exploitative. The man who paid rent for struggling families was the same man whose operations contributed to Harlem's underground economy in ways that had real costs for real people. But the contradictions that would be central to Frank Lucas's story were already present in Bumpy Johnson's. The man who built the thing that others would inherit had already established the template, power that was simultaneously communal and predatory, protective and extractive, genuine and self-serving. By 1968, Bumpy Johnson had been at the center of Harlem's underground economy for nearly 40 years. He had survived Dutch Schultz. He had survived the Italian mob's repeated attempts to subordinate black operators to Italian control. He had survived 3 federal prison sentences and multiple state charges. He had survived wars, raids, betrayals, and the specific attrition of a life lived at the intersection of violence and authority. He was 62 years old and dying. And he had not yet identified who would carry what he had built into the next chapter. The problem of succession is the most difficult problem that any organization faces. In legitimate businesses, succession is managed through institutional processes, boards of directors, executive searches, documented transitions of authority that allow an organization to survive the departure of any individual, however essential. The institution outlasts the person. Criminal organizations do not have institutional processes of this kind. They are, almost by definition, built around personal authority, the specific, unchallengeable authority of the person at the top, whose power derives from a combination of demonstrated capability, earned loyalty, and the implicit threat of violence. When that person is gone, the authority does not automatically transfer. It must be rebuilt, re-earned, re-established by whoever inherits the position. Bumpy Johnson had spent 40 years building personal authority in Harlem. That authority was not transferable in the way that a business is transferable. What could be transferred was something more specific: the relationships, the organizational infrastructure, the community standing, and the operational knowledge that the authority had produced and sustained. But transferring these things required finding someone capable of receiving them. Someone who could understand not just the mechanics of running the operation, but the deeper principle, the thing that Bumpy had built his authority on, that Madame St. Clair had taught him, and that he had developed over 4 decades. The principle was not complicated to state. It was extraordinarily difficult to embody. Harlem is not territory. It is not a market to be extracted. It is a community to be served, protected, and respected, even when the service, protection, and respect come alongside exploitation, because in Harlem's reality they always come alongside exploitation, and the question is not whether exploitation exists, but whether the person doing it understands what they owe in return. The operator who understood this, who could simultaneously extract value from the community and genuinely invest in it, who could be predatory and protective at the same time, who could hold the contradiction without resolving it falsely in either direction. This was the operator who could maintain authority in Harlem. Who could do what Bumpy had done? Bumpy had been looking for this person for years. He had not found them. The young men he had trained, the operators he had mentored, the people who had come through his organization and developed real capability, almost none of them had what he was looking for. They were capable in specific ways. Good at enforcement, or at financial management, or at street-level distribution, or at managing relationships with the Italian mob. But the holistic intelligence he was looking for, the thing that had made Madame St. Clair extraordinary, and that he himself had embodied in his own way, this was rare. It might be the rarest thing there was. The 5 men who came to his office in the spring of 1968 represented his latest attempt to find it. The 5 men stood in his office. Bumpy Johnson looked at them for a long time without speaking. Illinois Gordon stood by the door. The spring light came through the windows and illuminated the office, the desk, the books, the chess set that was always there, the particular organized quality of a space that reflected its occupant's mind. Then Bumpy asked his question. He said, "Tell me what Harlem needs? Not, what can you do for me? Not, what is your experience? Not, what operations have you run? What territory do you control? What is your capacity for violence or your organizational infrastructure? Tell me what Harlem needs. The question was a test, but not the kind of test the five men were expecting. They had prepared for the conventional questions, for the assessment of their criminal credentials, their operational capability, their loyalty networks. They had not prepared for a question that required something other than criminal competence to answer. The first man answered, Harlem needs protection. Someone to keep the Italians out, to maintain the community's ability to operate without outside interference. He was not wrong, but he was answering the question of power, not the question of community. Bumpy heard, this man wants to run a protection operation. He knows how to enforce. He does not know what he is enforcing for. The second man answered, Harlem needs money, better distribution of the wealth that the underground economy generates. More of it staying in the community instead of flowing out to Italian suppliers and corrupt police. He was also not wrong, but he was answering the question of economics, not the question of people. Bumpy heard, this man understands finance. He does not understand that finance is in service of something. The third man answered, Harlem needs organization. The fragmented operations, the competing interests, the lack of coordination that allowed external forces to exploit the divisions, these needed to be resolved through unified control. He was making an organizational argument. Bumpy heard, this man wants to be king. He has mistaken the crown for the responsibility. The fourth man said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, Harlem needs what it has always needed. What every community needs, dignity. The specific dignity of people who are told by every legitimate institution that they are worth less than they are, that their lives and their neighborhood matter less than other lives and other neighborhoods. The underground economy exists because the legitimate economy has failed this community. Anyone who operates in that economy owes the community something for having used its people and its geography. He was closest. Bumpy looked at him for a moment longer than the others. But there was something still missing, a practicality, a specific understanding of how the abstract principle translated into operational decisions. The fifth man had been quiet through all of this. He had listened to the other's answer. He had, in the specific way of someone who is more interested in understanding the question than in being first to answer it, waited. Then Frank Lucas said, Harlem needs someone who understands that it's both things at once. It needs the money and the protection and the organization, but it also needs someone who knows that those things are means, not ends. The end is the community, the actual people, the families, the kids, the old women who can't make rent. Anyone who forgets that is just extracting. And extraction without investment destroys what it's drawing from. Eventually, you run out of community to extract from. So what Harlem needs is someone who can do both. Who can build the operation that generates the resources and use those resources in ways that sustain what they're drawing from. Bumpy Johnson was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Everyone else can go. 4 men left. Frank Lucas stayed. What followed, in the months between that Tuesday morning in the spring of 1968 and Bumpy Johnson's death that July, was the most consequential mentorship in the history of Harlem's underground economy. It was not primarily operational. Frank Lucas already had operational capability. He had been working in and around the underground economy for 20 years, had developed his own organizational skills, his own network, his own understanding of how the street-level business worked. He did not need Bumpy Johnson to teach him how to run a distribution operation. What Bumpy gave him was something else. He gave him the relationships. 40 years of carefully cultivated relationships with every significant figure in Harlem's underground economy, with the Italian families whose cooperation was necessary for any major operation to function without constant warfare, with the corrupt police whose cooperation was necessary for any major operation to function without constant interdiction, with the community figures, the church leaders, the political operators, the legitimate business owners, the neighborhood institutions, whose implicit acceptance was necessary for any major operation to function without constant community opposition. These relationships were not transferable in the way that a contact list is transferable. They were personal, built on Bumpy Johnson's specific authority, his specific reputation, his specific history with each person and institution. They could not be inherited automatically, but they could be introduced. Bumpy Johnson could say to every person who mattered in Harlem, "This is Frank Lucas. He is my choice. He understands what I have built and why. When I am gone, he is the person you will work with." This introduction, this act of transfer, was worth more than any operational asset Bumpy could have provided. It gave Frank Lucas a standing in Harlem's power structure that would have taken years to build independently. Bumpy also gave him something more abstract but equally important. He gave him the framework, the way of thinking about Harlem not as a territory or a market, but as a community with needs and obligations, as a place that produced the people who worked in the underground economy and would bear the costs of how that economy was run. The framework that said, "You are not separate from this place. You are of it. What you do to it, you do to yourself. What you take from it, you owe back." Frank Lucas internalized this framework. He applied it, in his own way, throughout the years of the Invisible Empire. The rent payments, the community investments, the specific attention to the human cost of the operation that was visible in moments like the confrontation with Reverend Thompson. These were not simply strategic image management. They were the expression of a framework that Bumpy Johnson had passed on. The framework did not prevent the devastation. Blue magic killed people. The operation exploited the community it served and protected. The contradiction that was central to Bumpy's story was equally central to Frank Lucas's story. But the framework was real, and it shaped the operation in ways that a purely extractive model would not have been shaped. In July 1968, 3 months after their first meeting, Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack in the Lennox Lounge. He was 62 years old. He died in the neighborhood he had protected and exploited and loved and damaged for 40 years. Frank Lucas was at his side when he died. He had been there for 3 months, learning, absorbing, being introduced and vouched for and prepared. 3 months was not enough to transfer 40 years. But it was what there was. And Frank Lucas, who was nothing if not efficient with what he was given, used it. Here is what the inheritance meant. Frank Lucas inherited an organizational infrastructure that had been built over 40 years by 2 extraordinary people, Madame Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson, who had both understood, in their own ways, that the underground economy was not simply an extraction but a relationship, that Harlem was not simply a market but a community, that the operator owed something to the place that made the operation possible. He also inherited the contradiction that neither of them had resolved. The contradiction was this: the underground economy, however it was run, however much it invested back into the community, was fundamentally extractive. The numbers racket took money from poor people through a mechanism that was mathematically in the operator's favor. The heroin trade took money from addicted people through a mechanism that made addiction more likely and harder to escape. The protection operations, the enforcement networks, the various informal taxes and arrangements, all of these extracted value from a community that had limited value to spare. St. Clair had understood this and tried to offset it through genuine community investment, genuine opposition to outside exploitation, genuine legal and political advocacy. Bumpy had understood this and tried to offset it through the same means, amplified by his longer tenure and broader relationships. Frank Lucas inherited their framework. He applied it, in his own way, with his own intelligence and his own limitations. And he ran heroin of extraordinary purity through a community that was already struggling. The contradiction did not resolve. It intensified. The rent payments were real. The devastation was larger. The community investment was genuine. The extraction was greater. The framework that Bumpy gave Frank Lucas shaped a human being and softened the edges of what might otherwise have been pure predation. But it did not transform extraction into something else. It made the extraction more bearable for the extractor, gave him a story about who he was and what he owed, without making the extraction less costly for the community. This is the specific legacy of the mentorship. Not the organizational genius, not the operational capability. The story, the framework that made it possible for Frank Lucas to look at himself and see not simply a drug dealer but a community figure, a protector, someone who understood and honored his obligations. The story was true in part. The part it left out was the part that Baltimore's hospitals documented in a single night in October 1971. Bumpy Johnson died before Blue Magic. He died before the full flowering of what he had helped build. He died in 1968, the year Frank Lucas went to Bangkok for the first time, the year the Southeast Asian sourcing began, the year the invisible empire started becoming what it would eventually be. He did not live to see what his framework was applied to, whether he would have approved, disapproved, or recognized in it the same contradiction he had always lived with. This is the question the legacy poses without answering. Bumpy Johnson sat in the Lennox Lounge for the last time on July 7, 1968. He asked the waiter for a glass of water. He put his head down on the table. He never raised it again. Frank Lucas was in the building. He walked over. He looked at the man who had chosen him, who had trusted him, who had spent 3 months preparing him for something he would spend the next 7 years building. He put his hand on Bumpy Johnson's shoulder. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The crown had been passed. The contradiction had been inherited. The work was about to begin. The chain runs from Martinique to Harlem to North Carolina. Stephanie St. Clair built the infrastructure. She established the runner networks, the financial disciplines, the community relationships, the model of black ownership of the underground economy in Harlem. She fought the Italian mob and the corrupt police and Dutch Schultz and maintained something that was genuinely Harlem's. Bumpy Johnson inherited it. He expanded it, protected it, maintained it through 3 decades of pressure from every direction. He added his own dimensions, the chess player's strategic intelligence, the community figure's moral weight, the specific warmth and anger and complexity of a man who was genuinely of the place he ran. Frank Lucas inherited from Bumpy. He transformed what he inherited, took the organizational framework and made it more sophisticated, took the community model and made it more complex, took the supply chain and went further than anyone had gone before. Each generation built on what the previous one had built. Each inherited a contradiction and made it larger. The Frank Lucas mythology treats him as an originator, the self-made man, the genius who appeared from nowhere and built something unprecedented. This is not accurate. He was the 3rd generation of an organizational tradition that began with a Martinique-born woman counting her savings at a kitchen table in Harlem in 1923. The genius was real. The inheritance was also real. And the question that the 5 men answered differently on that Tuesday morning in 1968, "Tell me what Harlem needs," was not Bumpy Johnson's question alone. It was Madame St. Clair's question, asked in a different form for 40 years before Bumpy asked it. It was the question at the center of everything the underground economy was and was not. What does Harlem need? Frank Lucas answered it better than the other 4 men in the room. He spent the next 7 years proving that the answer, however correct, was insufficient, because what Harlem needed and what Frank Lucas gave it were not the same thing. Close enough for Bumpy to choose him. Not close enough for the balance to hold. The chain runs from St. Clair to Bumpy to Lucas, and what it carries is not just organizational knowledge or criminal methodology. It carries the contradiction, the thing that none of them could resolve, the thing that Harlem has been living with since before any of them arrived, the underground economy and the community it serves, the extraction and the investment, the protection and the predation. Both things, always in the same hands.